one of my concerns is there's this idea out there kind of in the water in evangelicalism that there's like a gift of evangelism. But if you look to the Bible, you'll actually look in vain to find a reference to it. All God's people actually have a responsibility to share the gospel. So it's not just, well, I have a gift or I don't.
From Chicago, this is Vertical Ministry with James MacDonald. What every heart longs for, what every church can be. Hey everybody, I'm Landon and I'm excited for you to take a listen to these frankly just amazing conversations all about vertical ministry and why we believe it can be absolutely life-changing. On this episode of the Vertical Ministry Podcast, we get to hear an inspiring message about vertical evangelism with Pastor James, Ed Stetzer, and Pastor Ron Zappia. Pastor Ron's the lead pastor of High Point Church in the western suburbs of Chicago. Listen in as Ron shares his powerful testimony, and we hear my dad's inspiration for sharing his faith person to person. Let's go.
Well, hey, it's great to be in the studio with you guys. I appreciate Landon introducing us. And this is the Vertical Ministry Podcast, where we're trying to emphasize what verticality in church ministry is all about. And Ron, Ed, this session, we're going to be talking about the pillar of evangelism. So let me just say to you two, who gets to own the role of evangelism in the church? Is this about the pastor or is this about the people?
Yeah, I think, James, if I can just jump in right away, man, I think it's got to be both. I mean, it's compelling for both people have got to own it. The pastor's got to do this. He's got to be the one to model it. He's got to be the one to inspire. He's got to be the one to share stories of success and failure. I think more time we talk about success than, failure is good in this case. And the people, they need to just really embrace it, get a feel for it and embrace that they want to do it.
You said so many good things there, like all at once. Like I love your idea that the pastor's got to be doing it. I was just sharing my faith recently, and we were out at a restaurant with some friends, and I got to the end and I spoke some things to the person who had been serving us, and I just thought, I haven't done that as intentional as I should have many times. And I know you do this, Ron. I really like that. It has to start with, it has to be everywhere.
Yeah, it does.
But if the pastor's not sharing his faith, if the pastor's not trying to see lost people won, he shouldn't be surprised if the people aren't. And then I also want to come back to what you said about it's okay to fail.
Yeah, because if you're not trying, you're not going to fail. If you're trying, you're going to fail. I mean, not everybody you share the gospel with is going to come to faith in Christ.
I need a biblical basis for that. Ed, could you supply a biblical reference
where's that in the text?
To support the idea that?
Yeah, I mean, there seem to be a lot.
Parable
Parable of the sower. There are four sowers parables.
I don't know who was whispering there, Ed, but Ed had that himself.
Well, but really what I was saying too is this. I think we want to be doing it and modeling in our life, but we also want to be talking about it from the front, at the stage. And really, I find that the most compelling when you just, you season and pepper your message with opportunities that you've had in sharing your faith, because then I think our people get it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm totally convicted about that because I can't even remember when I've ever done that. And as Ron was saying that, because I could tell that story about sharing my faith.
Yeah, you should.
And I think what he's saying is right, Ed. And when he was saying it, it was reminding me, it's no surprise that you two got together because I've known Ron since the early 90s. I remember when the Lord called him into ministry, and he has always had a passion for evangelism. Now you, Ed, you have a whole series that you teach and programs that you bring to churches to help them think about evangelism. So you guys are two peas in a pod down there at High Point in Naperville.
Stop it.
And very much though, I think for pastors, you can't lead what you don't live.
Right.
And so I think by articulating that, one of the things, we mentioned earlier, Hybels. Mention Hybels for 1 second more. How many people know about Bill Hybels' sailboat? Why do we know about Bill Hybels' sailboat? Why should we know? Well, because he's always talking about that's a place where he shares the gospel.
I was just at a wedding. I'm sorry.
No,
or not a wedding. It was
a
graduation, my daughter's graduation. And somebody came up to me and they said they had come to our church and they told that same thing. They go like, well, Bill, do you have a sailboat?
Do you have a sailboat? That's right.
I'm like, no, I don't have a sailboat.
See, that's why
However,
I'm not sure I use the example of the gym.
So this week I'm going to tell my church
go to the barber.
that if I had a sailboat,
you'd win people to Jesus.
I would win people to Jesus. I think that's the big
for
missing.
you, it's the gym. I can assure you, the gym's not my place. For me, it's my neighborhood. So, matter of fact, the last time I was here at this harvest, were you, Pastor James? Too many harvests. Sometimes it can be confusing for me. But last time I was here, I actually drew on a chart my 8 neighbors that, as a pastor, I sought to intentionally engage, and 7 of 8 shared the gospel with, led some to Christ, baptized some. But I share that constantly in my church because in doing so, again, I'm leading because I'm living it, and people see that. So I really think, as we look at the pillars, and we've been looking at pillars for the last few episodes, as we look at these pillars of vertical church ministry, this is a key area. And I do think Ron's kind of a poster child for this, but I also think, James, you've evidenced that in what you've seen here at Harvest with so many people coming to faith in Christ.
Well, one of the things that Ron will be familiar with is the way that we talk about red apples and green apples. And I don't even know if you're entirely familiar with that terminology.
I don't know that.
But just talk about that as that kind of what your memories are of that concept and idea, Ron, from when you were one of our pastors, and how you found that helpful in thinking about vertical church evangelism. Because it's not just a matter of we're all committed to this gospel, we all want to get the message out, but when you start talking about red apples and green apples, you're talking about how to do it most biblically and effectively.
Yeah, and just to go backwards, just so everybody understands, I mean, what is it? Well, a red apple and a green apple. It's somebody who's ripe for the gospel, somebody who's not. One of the things that I learned here, many years ago, and I say it continually and teach other pastors this and our people, is that the circumstances of life ripen you to the gospel. I mean, there's no greater truth than that. You see it in the scriptures. You see it in our own experience. I had that evidenced in my own life. The circumstances of life, whether it's death, whether it's divorce, whether it's difficulty, whether it's disease, whatever. I happen to pick a bunch of D words there. Sorry. I'm sure there's
done. You're nearly Baptist.
That was very pastoral. I wanted to start playing the music and bring the invitation.
Stop it. But whatever it is, I mean, those circumstances lead you to a place where you're more open and receptive. I mean, I saw that with my parents when my mom got cancer. I was the first believer in our family. Yep. Jody and I, and my mom went through cancer, and that was the thing, that led them and put them in a place where they finally embraced Him. So red apple, green apple is this. Don't waste all your time. I want to say that carefully. Don't waste all your time on people who are not ready, not ripe, not wanting. Not that we don't want to invest, not that we don't want to share, not that we don't want to be open, but looking for the people that are really ripe for the gospel. And, that's the neighbor next door who is going through a difficult time. I remember when I was a youth pastor here, James, I mean, one of the things that I used to tell our students is this. Look for the kid who at the cafeteria, at the lunchroom, is only there by themselves, sitting by themselves. That's the kid that needs Jesus. That's the kid willing to listen. That's the kid you want to share with. And I think if we take those principles, that maximizes opportunity.
It's funny because I think you said it nicer than me. I think I used to say, look for the kid in the corner of the cafeteria with the pocket protector and the tape on his glasses. He knows his thing's not working.
So first of all, you guys are talking about me here. I'm a little offended. I don't think either of you were that kid in high school.
Well, we want to share the faith with you now.
Thank you. That's why you brought me here today.
No, but the idea is so important. I remember being so stirred by John 4:35. The fields are ripe to harvest. But a lot of people say, well, I teach at a school, and I don't see anybody ripe in the faculty lounge, or I'm looking on my street. I don't see any people that ripe. But if the Bible says that people lift up your eyes and look, the fields are ripe for harvest. So this is a biblical analogy. And the point is instead of picking the person that you want to see saved, and then taking them to baseball games for 10 years till they ripen to the gospel, look for the person who God has already ripened to the gospel. We like to teach our people, when you take care of what's on God's heart, God takes care of what's on your heart. So I'm so burdened for my prodigal son that it's all I can think about. Yeah, well, if you'd get out and share your faith and share with others and take care of what's on God's heart, that is such an invocation for God to take care of what's on your heart. And I really, really believe with all my heart that if we would spend less time focusing on the person we want to be saved so we can have a better night's sleep, and instead would focus on the people who the circumstances are very obviously bringing them to a place where they know their thing's not working. Now they're ready for something different. And, when you've baptized, some of these, I'm sure you do this too, Ron, but every so often we'll have an invitation for people that have never been baptized. We don't give an invitation for the gospel every week. Some do, but we'll periodically give an invitation for people who have trusted the Christ over the last few months, have committed to faith in Christ, to to come and be baptized. And then when you baptize 100 people or 200 people, and like Ron said, you ask every one of them, how did you come to know Christ? The label on the boulder changes, but the story's always the same. I thought that I didn't need God, and God dropped a boulder on my life. That's the story. It's the same story, every story. So by the time why don't you just start looking for people that are under a rock? Right. Isn't that the whole point with Zacchaeus? Look for a guy who's up a tree. Look for people who know their thing's not working. Like you said, there is going to be rejection. There is going to be failure in evangelism. But if we would focus our efforts on those who appear to be ripe, we'd see more fruit.
Yeah, and I think this, James, I think really, the biblical analogy for that, or should I say the theology behind it, I mean, Jesus had a two-pronged strategy for evangelism. And what he did was he simply did this. He went and he cared for people and he shared. And he said, go out. He sent his guys out, the people to go and heal the sick. I see that as caring for people. There's the care. And then he said, repent and believe. There's the share piece. And so the two-pronged strategy that we need to do is the same. And I think sometimes as Christians, we don't do a great job at the caring piece because we just want to share. And I think, not that we're going to earn the time forever and spend all the time, but sitting with somebody, hearing their story, having a cup of coffee with them. I mean, that gives you the opportunity to say a good word for Jesus and step it up. So
yeah, there's a phrase that Mission America Coalition actually uses, developing a prayer, care, share lifetime. Totally. You just needed one more air in there, and you would have gotten that.
We like to say it like this at our church. We like to say, that
hey, at our church, the one I'm a part of, so I should know this. I don't remember this phrase. Go ahead.
we want to care, and we want to share with prayer, but not flare. So we don't want to throw any behind the bag passes or anything. We want to make it real easy. We want to just make it really simple.
And then when you close the service, you say, I've got a dare.
Yeah, wow. Exactly. I don't
dare
care.
You to do this.
I don't care.
Right. All right, enough of that.
But I got a question for you, but I want to preface it.
Yep.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was what's the role of the pastor, what's the role of the people. And one of my concerns is there's this idea out there kind of in the water in evangelicalism that there's like a gift of evangelism. There are spiritual gifts tests that will find for you the gift of evangelism. But if you look to the Bible, you'll actually look in vain to find a reference to it. There's a reference to evangelists who equip God's people for works of ministry, but all God's people actually have a responsibility to share the gospel. So it's not just, well, I have a gift or I don't. Now, what's interesting was there's some data that's actually shifting. People ask, what percentage of people have the gift of evangelism? You probably heard 10% have the gift of evangelism because that's been in the water since the 80s. But when you ask, and Barna's been doing a study, it's actually lower and lower and lower. Now it's 1% or so say they have the gift of evangelism. When that means is 99% are people say, well, I don't have the gift, so I don't have to evangelize. And the 1% who think they have the gift feel they do. And I think ultimately, no, all of us have a responsibility to share the gospel.
So there's no gift of evangelism. All of us have a responsibility to share the gospel. And just comment on that, Ron.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. Ed, I remember reading this and hearing this from you, and it really enlightened me because I had always wrestled a bit with that. I wasn't sure if I had totally developed my theology on that. And I wasn't, because a lot of people said to me, hey, you have the gift of evangelism. I didn't feel like I had the gift. I didn't know what that meant. I knew I had a heart to share. But it really helped relieve me. I'm not worried that I have a gift. I don't have a gift. I got to do the work.
Yeah.
Do the work of evangelism. And
right, and
it's
it is
not
work.
Easy, man.
And if you think about what the gifts are that are revealed in the New Testament, so you talk about what you were saying, we kidded a bit, but the truth of the matter is that prayer and care and share is actually quite helpful.
Yeah, it's kind of universal.
Just like we give people a plan for how to have a personal prayer time, we give people a plan for how to actually connect with people. And I think that if you have gifts of mercy, you might find that the caring part is more intuitive. Yep. And if you have gifts of teaching, you might find that the sharing part's more intuitive. But everybody's going to find something in the prayer, care, share sequence that is more stretching for them. And these things just cause us to depend upon the Lord. And I love the emphasis here that we're all called to do it. Now, what is vertical in our vertical church philosophy? What ways are we adjusting thinking about evangelism to make it more of a God-focused thing? While you think about that, I'll offer one thing that I know we emphasize, which is that God is the one who does the saving. So instead of looking at myself like a person who's pulling off a sales transaction, when I met Ron was a salesman for a company that made brass plumbing fixtures. And we used to tease about that. And now he's got the best product and it's free, you know. But Ron was gifted at, but you can remember when you're selling something, you're always shaping your sentences, hoping to draw the person in, hoping not to turn them off. But in vertical evangelism, you're really just trying to be a faithful witness to the gospel, that we have a body of truth. And God just needs the word spoken faithfully, boldly, which bold is the book of Acts. They were bold, they were threatened that with physical harm. They went back and said in Acts 4, you hear their threats. Now grant that your servants would continue to speak your word with boldness. In other words, don't let fear diminish our boldness. Paul said in Ephesians 6, pray for me that I might speak boldly as I ought to speak. And so a bold witness to the true content of the gospel without fear of rejection, without needing to shape or round off the corners to make it palatable. God is the one who does the saving, and he's never up in heaven going, whoa, wow, you really said the hard part at the wrong time. That the saving act of God transcends the inefficiencies in the faithful, bold witness, and that God honors a bold witness to the gospel with some fruit in his time. I think the problem is that, and back to what you were saying, I think that when we get rejected, we feel like failed presentation.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a failed presentation.
Well, that's why I think the call to boldness is really essential here. Now, boldness doesn't mean brashness.
There's
a difference between the two. But boldness, when we look at the statistics, and we couldn't have a podcast without me trying to get a couple of stats in, but when we look at the stats.
I prefer if you'd quoted yourself instead of George Barna.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
I've got it. It's Lifeway Research.
I mean, you're right here, Ed. So we don't need to call George Barna.
That's true. But Lifeway Research, actually, here's what we find. We ask them, among Protestant churchgoers, people who are regularly attending church, in the past 6 months, how many times have you personally shared with someone how to become a Christian? I mean, that's bold. It's not just inviting them to church. No, that's good. We'll take that. That's a good step. Yeah. But 61% said zero. So I haven't shared with anybody how to become, and 16% said one, and people tend to exaggerate for the good when they answer, or even for church, only 48% said zero.
That's called the Hawthorne effect. Actually, when people perform to this, I don't know if you know that.
I'm vaguely familiar with research background and terminology.
Oh my gosh.
So let's get back to the equation.
Let's get back to evangelism.
What we said was, though, is we talked about what is the vertical nature of it. And I think part of it is to understand the definition of boldness. We've used this before, and I know, James, you'll agree, it's a spirit-led conviction and enablement that I've got to speak up about who Jesus is, what he's done, and what he wants to do in you. And that's boldness. It's spirit-led. It's not something I can manufacture, and it's an enablement. It's from God, and I just don't think you can bruise the fruit. I think we can move forward and we can try.
The bruise the fruit thing. Tell me more about that.
I think a lot of times people think that, I can say something at the wrong time or do something, and I just don't think you can bruise the fruit. I mean, God's in control. He's sovereign, and I don't want to be foolish and I don't want to be stupid, but his sovereignty sometimes covers my stupidity, and I don't, I want to be bold in my witness. I want to be looking for opportunities. I think it's like this, though. People are so fearful because they don't know the spiritual laws. They don't know how to shape their testimony. And I think, I go back to if we just were more open about sharing our own personal relationship with God and what God's doing in our own lives, I think it would be a lot easier for us to share. I would challenge the church that, what it says in Acts chapter 4, for we cannot stop speaking about what we've seen and heard.
That's boldness.
If God
we cannot
is working,
stop speaking about this.
If God's working and doing things in our life, restoring marriages, helping us, comforting us through hard times, I mean, it's not all the words. I mean, God's doing the work, God's doing the saving, he uses us as a mouthpiece. But just, you don't have to go for the gold or go for the gusto in the one sentence and slay the dragon. I mean, it's just like, hey, man, you hear somebody who's going through a hard time and they say, yeah, this has been real tough. I've been going through this. And you say, you know what? I'll tell you, man, I can't identify totally with that, but I've gone through hard times. And the times that I've gone through hard times, God's been there for me. And if you'd want to know about that, I could tell you more.
Exactly.
I mean,
so sometimes I think we feel like evangelism is I'm going to go all the way down the Romans road. I'm going to get entirely across the bridge illustration. I'm going to draw the entire thing with every verse. Like there's something in between the full totality. And so I wouldn't in any way contradict what Ron said, but I would just say that maybe bruising the fruit is when I go further than the Spirit led me to go.
But you mentioned bruising the fruit in the first podcast that we had.
Right. If you can't pick the fruit, don't bruise it. But Ron is rightly saying,
you're saying relationally, individually. So there's not necessarily a disagreement between you two. Early on, you said, don't bruise the fruit in the church context. But relationally, You're saying don't be so concerned about bruising the fruit
that you don't say anything, that you're silent,
and
that you don't take a risk relationally, because you know what? I mean, if the person loves you and there's a respect for you, I mean, you ought to be shared what the most important relationship is in your heart.
All right, I'm going to be that guy right now. I'm going to interrupt this podcast, and I hate it when people do that to me. So please, I'm just going to take a second, okay? I just want to tell you that we've got a really good deal for you for Vertical Church Conference in August. So if you go to the website, which is verticalchurchconference.org, you can register right now, and you can use the special promo code POD25, POD25, and that's going to get you $25 off of your registration fee. So you can do that right now on your cell phone, wherever you are. Register today and bring a friend, because living vertical will truly change your life. One more thing. If you're enjoying this podcast, you're really going to like the stuff we're doing on my dad's podcast. Just search James MacDonald in the iTunes podcast app, and you're going to get daily teaching, weekly sermons, and a lot of other cool stuff from the ministry. All right, let's get back to the conversations.
No, I don't think I'm following you.
Sowing seeds.
Oh, yeah, sowing seeds, right.
Yeah,
sure. Thanks, Ed.
So see what I did there? Did you see what I did there?
See how I turned that back? That was beautiful. So sowing the seed would be a partial. And just to reiterate for those who are listening in on this, and I hope and pray that this is helpful to you, you know, the call to engage in evangelism, to see lost people, to believe that God is ripening people of the gospel, to look for them, to be prepared to share and to not fear bruising the fruit, but to embrace a Spirit-led conviction that I must say something.
That's good.
And then when you've said all that the Spirit's leading you to say, then stop. And if everything that the person is saying is I really wish you would stop saying this right now, I'm freaking. I like if every nonverbal, because I can tell you when I've had the joy of leading people to Christ, there were maybe bumpy parts in the conversation, but there was no loud and clear, I need you to stop.
It's so true.
And once I'm forcing it past the verbal and nonverbal signals, then I think I'm not being led by the Spirit anymore, and that's not boldness. That's what did you say was the brashness?
Yeah, brashness. The contrast,
so more like I need to say this for my own sake, and real evangelism is always for the sake of the hearer, not because of some internal need I have to get it said.
So let me come back to in the Vertical Church. You tell a great story about your mom sharing the gospel with neighbors. And how did that impact your sense of responsibility? Because we've talked about all people having responsibility, but towards people who don't know Christ.
Well, I've always actually preached about and challenged our church about Christian parents who want Christ for their kids, but they don't want it for the neighbors. It's really hard for a kid to figure that out. Like, how is it that my parents are telling me that I need Jesus so badly, but they don't seem to care about if anybody else knows Jesus? I mean, my uncle's not saved, and the people my dad works with aren't saved, and the people on our street aren't saved, but they're so fired up for us to find Jesus, but they don't seem to be worried about. And see, I didn't have that.
That's fascinating.
I grew up with my mom. I can't tell you how many times I walked into the kitchen and saw my mom with her hands across the table around a couple of cups of coffee, praying with one of the neighbors. Wow. When I think about all the houses around our house, my mom died very prematurely from ALS in 2010. And I was at her funeral, and several of the neighbors that my mom shared Christ with, including two, got up and gave eulogies for my mom as the instrument through which they found
believers in Christ.
Yeah, believers in Christ. My mom had led years and years before, and she did this right up until the end of her life, as long as she could talk. Wow. And so I'm going to tell you, that is a compelling thing when you see in the most influential people in your life, back to the pastor, back to your parents, that, hey, they don't just want me to be saved so that their little world can come together. They care about lost people everywhere. I think that's about as powerful as it gets in parenting.
One of the things I like and I really love about High Point. I got to remember we've changed the name, so
Yes.
it's High Point. So I preached there this weekend, and I brought up High Point. I was shameless. All right. So one of the things I love about it is the passion for evangelism that's there. Yeah. But one of the things. So where does the idea of is being culturally relevant still an obstacle to that? What are some issues about how we do church and how we engage some of these things that need to be considered or changed? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the whole culturally relevant discussion, it kind of hinders us at times because I think, you are relevant culturally to some group in some way. I have different influence in different kinds of people. You have different influence in different kinds of people. I feel like a lot of times we can do this, and I don't know if this is where you're going with this, Ed, but I feel like, I'm a relevant person. I want to bring God into the conversation. I've got to put myself in places where I can do that effectively. And as a pastor, unfortunately, sometimes I talk to people and we don't put ourselves in the places where we can be relevant and bring the gospel to bear.
And I would just add to that, Ron, that I love that idea. And I would just say there's just two things. There's a person who's found something, and there's a person who hasn't found it yet. And the problem with a lot of church evangelism in North America is we want to put a third thing in, which is, I like, muscle cars, or I'm into needlepoint, or don't you love flea markets? So we have to find this thing outside of the gospel. And I would say that it's my fallenness, my desperate internal need to know the God who made me, and the circumstances that have heightened me to that awareness. That's the right person. And then there's the bold evangelist that is on the lookout for those people. Yeah. Nothing else is needed. You don't need to take that lady to a baseball game. You don't need to take that kid to there's no third thing. There's just, I found it. I'm searching for something that I wasn't before.
Right, and there'll be bridges across which you communicate that. So you might be friends who go to a game, but the point is the gospel is big, and the gospel needs to be communicated. It's communicated in the context of, we talk about prayer, care, share again, in context of relationship or caring, but the gospel itself is worthy of being the tool that is communicated that changes the
I think what we're trying to say, too, is, realistically, the gospel is culturally relevant.
Yeah.
People are lost. People need Christ. People have needs.
But we have to believe that.
Yeah.
And I would say about the baseball game thing, Ed, I think that I would kind of say no.
No, really tell me.
The only reason I would say yes to that is because taking this person over here, I'm engaged. I have relationships with people who don't know the Lord. I think that's the point.
That's the point, right?
It isn't. I don't believe so much in earning the right to be heard, or over time living. You can't live a life contrary, but and certainly you can't. You can certainly do things that turn people off to the gospel. But the thing that changes the response readiness of the heart is God. And God allows things to happen in that person's life that brings them to the place. And it doesn't have to be a big, I got cancer. It could be an existential crisis. Yeah. It could be a profound loneliness. Yeah. It could be an unexplainable emptiness that has emerged because of my season of life. It isn't always the same thing. It's just something that has brought me up short. I have not known an adult conversion that didn't include in it everything was perfect. Everything was good. Everything was going along. But then I started running this huge deficit.
Yeah, the boulder.
Yeah, the boulder again. And that's the person that's ready. And they don't need a lot of mincing words or, square dancing. Yeah. They just need...
Square dancing was not what I was thinking. But I'm trying to figure out if we disagree or not. I actually don't think we do. But in the context of relationship. So in other words, I'm not taking somebody to a ball game so that I can have the evangelistic presentation in the seventh inning stretch. But I'm in relationship and friendship with some people, and I share the gospel with them.
I think that the relationship is kind of unimportant. I think that because I think the relationship's important so you can know people, so you're there.
So it's good to have a relationship, right?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I think that because of books written in the 70s on friendship evangelism,
you actually wrote about that in
stuff,
the book. You kind of push back on some of those ideas,
right? And so I think that got us all thinking. Well, it's all about making friends with people in order to get the gospel to them, and that's the third thing I'm talking about. Okay. I think that really, if we, and this is what vertical church is all about, and we're seeing it happen in churches around the world, if you just skip the third thing and start looking for people who are ripe to the gospel, you're going to have the opportunity to lead a lot of people to Christ.
I agree with that, but you also need to have some means by which to know them. I think of like Paul, the Areopagus. I think of like Paul at Pisidian Antioch or Paul at Lystra. In all three cases, he knew something about the people and engaged with them at some level so that he could. So I'm not saying I've got to...
So where are the places in society then where people are potentially under a rock? So when did you ever hear someone say, here's my evangelism strategy. I'm going to go and hang around AA classes. And I'm going to start going to AA, and I'm going to start going out for coffee with people afterward because
Right.
I already know these people are buying into the higher power thing. They just need some detail.
That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is like my last neighborhood. We're just friends. We have barbecues together. We care about one another. We have that prayer, care, share. So I'm praying for them, and one of them goes through a hard time, as they did, and some family issues. And so I had a relationship already. And I don't think we're disagreeing. I could be.
We don't. I think that's fantastic. But the problem I have with that, Ed, is that here comes your statistical capacity again. How many North Americans, as an example, actually even know a born-again Christian who could share the gospel with them?
Yeah, that's
I mean, we're damning the entirety of society if you have to be a neighbor of a born-again Christian to hear the gospel. But a lot of evangelism teaching over 20 years said, get 2 projects and take those to the finish line. And too bad for everybody else on the block.
I agree that's
well, nobody wants to be anybody's project.
Exactly.
That's for sure. And I think what you're saying, Ed, is, we want to be strategic in the way we utilize our relationships to get ourselves into places where we can meet people and we can share the gospel. And I think we can all agree on that.
And I agree with that. And I think it's good to just push one another a little bit for clear definitions. I'm going to just say this. Every person listening to this right now could write on a 3x5 card your 5 great enthusiasms. Mm-hmm. I have 5 great enthusiasms. You mentioned the Cubs in our first podcast. And I love the word, I love sports, and I love Mexican food, and I love, how far down the list do you have to go till I love Jesus Christ? Yeah. I love the Word of God. I love the fellowship of God's people. If those things don't come up in your top 5 enthusiasms, you're never going to lead anybody to Christ. Right. But if they do come up in your top 5 enthusiasms, then as you interact with and relate to people, you're going to be known as a person who is a go-to resource. A go-to resource when a person finds that they need more than what they have.
Two words. So we're coming up on the Vertical Church Conference, and here in the Vertical Ministry Podcast, we're talking about some of the pillars of such. People come to the conference, James. What are they going to see, hear, and experience that encourages them towards this idea, this pillar of vertical church in and around evangelism and sharing the gospel?
Well, Ron's going to preach. I'm going to preach. You're going to preach. We're going to have spirit-filled worship. We're going to have a room packed full of people. And, if your heart is dry, if your soul is parched, as so often happens to people in ministry, people serving the Lord, people come to this conference and they're like, wow, I haven't had church like that for a long time. It's what we call earth-shattering, window-rattling, life-altering encounter with the God of the universe. And that is what makes evangelism conversation and prayer conversation and all of these pillars. Those are byproduct conversations. The real focus is a passionate pursuit of the God who made you. That's what we're doing at Vertical Church Conference, and that will fire up something afresh within you from which these good outcomes flow.
Well, and I think, too, one of the things that I'm excited about is that, coming to this, a lot of times, a lot of ministry leaders listening, or pastors or church leaders, and you're going to church and you're doing stuff. You're responsible for stuff. You're planning stuff. You're doing all those things. Come to this. You'll be fed. You will engage in worship. You'll get around. You will sense the Spirit of God, and you'll get your heart ignited for Him and for what He wants. And I think that's what most excites me.
Yeah, amen.
I'm Ed Stetzer here with Ron Zappia and James MacDonald. See what I did? I got into my podcast mode. Okay. The book is Vertical Church. The conference is the Vertical Church Conference. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.